Thanks everyone for this kind invitation to be one of your last speakers of the day. I hope everybody's had coffee and is still awake. This is a homecoming for me. I spent a year here and sort of walked in, as you just heard, determined to educate myself about genetics, and walked out of MIT and a few classes also up at Brand X at Harvard, convinced that this was the largest problem out there, and frustrated by the sort of journalism about that problem and what seemed to me to be a sort of failure of journalism to translate what you folks were telling us into articles that the public could understand. So through some twists and turns of my career, I sort of wound up at the Times and wound up actually working as a reporter there on this beat starting in 2010. I want to start today by convincing you that we have begun to take your arguments seriously and apply ourselves to this problem and attempt to do a better job of explaining the science of climate change to the public. So what you will see up here is newspaper coverage of the climate issue, climate change and global warming, starting in the year 2000. We are the green spike over there. Scraping down along the bottom there is, there's a black line, I think, for the Wall Street Journal. That's probably not going to surprise anyone. USA Today is sort of scraping along the bottom there too, which actually does surprise me a little. This is just a count of stories with no quality information in it. If we could sort of deduct off what many people might describe as misleading Wall Street Journal op-eds, they might come along around zero down there at the bottom. They really don't have people working on this, pro or con. This is a moment in time that surprised a lot of us. This is, I want to say, September of 2014. What we learned at this summit between Barack Obama and President Xi of China is that in the back room, China and the United States had been talking for a year about the climate problem. And Mr. Obama, you know, with help, I think, from the sort of incredible air pollution situation in China, had managed to coax them out and into a much more constructive dialogue about climate change. And so this was an announcement that the United States and China had agreed on what their proposals would be going into the Paris Climate Conference, and we began to learn the details. Fast forward a year and some months, and pardon me, I'm going to have to be Marco Rubio a few times here. Got a tiny bit of a cold. Here we are a year later, a year and some months later in Paris. This is the Eiffel Tower lit up in green. As dramatic as this looks, we were actually at a hangar at the airport for this whole conference, way out in the far suburbs of Paris. The thing was just too big to sort of put anywhere else, and so we were in these kind of ticky-tacky plywood buildings that were built for the purpose. This was the big sort of global climate negotiation, and what I'm going to talk about a lot today is where does this agreement that was reached in Paris leave us. Here is the sort of celebratory moment when when the agreement was gavelled through. The fellow in the center there is Laurent Fabius. He's the foreign minister of France, so the head of that daunting diplomatic machine. The press calls him Laurent Fabulous, by the way, back in the press room. This was an amazing coup by the French government. If any country in the world, the tiniest country, had objected to this deal at the last minute, there would have been no deal. That's how this sort of bizarre UN climate negotiation system works. And so they flew around the world for a couple of years, sort of just gently tickling the belly of the beast, you know, everywhere they could, and getting people on board. We all turned up in Paris. The food was pretty good. They took care of people. And so here's the coverage of this landmark moment, and that photo you just saw. I have to say, the Times famously does this very seldom, put a story across the top of the front page. It's the only time in my life I've been involved with one that ran that way. Here we are, grand celebration of supposed progress in dealing with climate change. This picture, as it happens, was taken 2 minutes after the Paris deal was gavelled through. We actually thought about putting this on our front page, but NASA didn't get the processing done in time. A lot of the young people in the audience, I suspect, are not familiar with what's called the blue marble. This was a picture taken on December 7th, 1972, by the Apollo astronauts. And remember, up to that point in history, we had never been sort of far away enough from the Earth to get the whole thing in one picture frame. There's actually some bizarre back politics about whether to even release that picture, but it was eventually released. It's called the blue marble, and it had a pretty dramatic effect on people's consciousness all over the world, and our just awareness that we're living on this sort of fragile little blue orb hanging out there in this vast darkness of space. Nowadays, we get a blue marble photograph every 12 times a day, I think it is, because there's a satellite that NASA put up hanging out at the Lagrange point 1, L1. So this is like sort of a gravity neutral zone, pointing back at the Earth. It's also watching the sun. And on it is this camera called EPIC, otherwise known as GoreCam. A lot of you might remember this controversy. Al Gore suggested sending this thing up in the 90s. It was actually built in the 90s, and then there was a political flap about it, and sort of, do we really want to spend the money to do this? So the thing went into storage for a long time, and then it eventually got flown on a NASA mission, and so now we get these 12 photos a day. I put it up just to sort of remind us what the stakes are here, that we're talking, if you believe the high end of this risk distribution that climate science gives us about the future habitability of this planet. I think in these discussions, we sit in rooms and we talk about this problem in a kind of an abstract way. A lot of us are really still pinching ourselves, saying, Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're all saying, is this real? I mean, is the problem really as big as all our science and all our models are telling us that it is? Here's the Arctic sea ice, the first time that we had a satellite in space capable of looking at using radar. This is real. This is not an image. This is an interpolation of NASA radar imagery. This happens to have been my sophomore year of college. So that's September 1979 from the Nimbus 7 satellite. Here's what things looked like in September of 2012. So we've lost 40% of the sea ice in the Arctic over essentially my adult lifetime. There's been a bit of a recovery since September 2012, not as much as some of the skeptic blogs would have you believe. The ice is thin, it's slushy, it's vulnerable to further decay, and what is likely to happen, if history is any guide, is we'll have a couple more years of this current level of ice hanging around. This past September was the 4th lowest ice extent in the satellite record, and then we will see another decline. Here you can see them side by side. So if you've been sitting in a lawn chair on the moon over these years, you would have been able to see that with the naked eye, I think. That's how dramatic this change in the planet has been. From here forward, I'm just going to entertain you with some pretty pictures of, this is a woman named Fiamma Stranio. Some of you might know her. She's down at Woods Hole. She's hanging out of a helicopter there over the Greenland ice sheet, over a fjord in Greenland, taking temperature of the water. These are pictures that were shot for a time series that ran over the course of about 3 years that we called Temperature Rising, in which we attempted to take your science and do a better job of turning it into stories that the public could understand. It got a tremendous response. It won some awards. We have been told that one of the close readers of that series was one Barack Obama. So we might have had a sort of scientific political feedback loop going on here. You're seeing pictures from Greenland. You'll see a lot of pictures of ice. Of course, it's that melting ice that's winding up in the streets of Miami Beach, as you saw in the earlier picture today. You're going to see pictures of dying forests, dying from a combination of heat stress and heat-loving insects. You will see again, as we saw earlier today, the drone flights over the meltwater river on the top of the Greenland ice sheet. I think we apparently are the first newspaper to have flown a drone over the Greenland ice sheet, and so that's become a very popular video. As we just sort of look at these pictures that are, I mean them to remind us of the stakes, really, in this sort of troubled world we are living in. I want to sort of talk about what the Paris Agreement means and what it doesn't mean, and where it leaves us in this complicated dialogue between science and society. The Paris Agreement has been billed as a breakthrough, and indeed it was, in the following sense. We are finally breaking down this distinction that we've had in 20 years of global climate negotiations between the developed and the developing countries. 196 countries, I want to say, offered plans, I might be off by a couple, covering better than 90% of global emissions. We got unanimous agreement to the deal itself, and the deal recognizes, it criticizes itself. It's very odd, but it sort of recognizes that it doesn't do enough. And so to cope with that, we put this mechanism in the deal where we're going to come back every 5 years and have what's called a global stock take. The first of those, I want to say, in 2023. And every time, countries are supposed to ratchet up their commitments. So we are supposedly going into a regime now in which climate policy will get sort of tougher and tougher over time. The deal has pretty tough reporting requirements and no real distinction between developed and developing countries. Now, the details of that was sort of kicked down the road a little bit. That will be the subject of fights over the next 2 or 3 years, I'm sure. There are promises of money in the deal, non-binding promises, but what we've said to the developing countries is we're sorry for causing this problem. To help us all deal with it, we would like you to skip the high carbon phase of development. And they have said to us, okay, but we can't afford that. Green energy is still more expensive, so help us. And we're saying, we're willing to help you. We've promised to mobilize $100 billion a year starting by 2020 in global climate finance. If that were all public money, that would be a doubling of the world's foreign aid budget. It's quite unlikely that it will all be public money. And in fact, this is one of the fights already emerging after Paris, is exactly how much is public money versus private money that's been mobilized in some way by the public money. But the promise is there. The heart of the Paris deal is these nationally determined contributions. Meaning all these countries essentially said, this was the key to the political breakthrough. We had tried for 20 years to get a system in which there were going to be sort of top-down targets and timetables, and the Europeans really wanted a sort of regime where everybody gets hammered for not meeting their goals. When we finally abandoned that and said, just come tell us what you can do, that unlocked a tremendous amount of political ambition. And lo and behold, all sorts of countries were suddenly willing to play who had not been willing to play before. I think that's telling us something about the nature of the international regime, maybe even about, maybe there are people here who know about game theory and can explain how all this works. When you add, as we've sort of heard a bit today, when you add the numbers up, they don't add up. Meaning, we are still far, even if these commitments are kept and kept diligently, we are still very far away from meeting the 2C goal. And by the way, the Paris deal, although it sort of ratified the 2C goal, it also said we need to aspire to 1.5C. If you just track out the current emissions trajectory that we're on, to meet the 2C goal, we are out of carbon space in the atmosphere in essentially 30 years, 30 to 35 years. To meet the 1.5C goal, we are out of carbon space in the atmosphere, sometime between now and the early 2020s. I don't know about you folks, but when I look around, I don't see the sort of scale of technological transformation that it's going to take to meet the 2C goal, much less 1.5C. So if we're serious about these goals, we're really up against it here in terms of time and in terms of the sort of scale of the transformation that's going to be needed. The targets for a lot of countries, are fairly weak. The United States target, for example, it's a 32% reduction, I think, from 2015 emissions. But if you put it on the 1990 timescale that we're all supposed to be using in theory, it's only a 2 or 3% reduction. Essentially, what we're trying to do right now is walk back the huge emissions gains that we had in the economic growth of the 90s and the early aughts. So now the last thing to know is this deal doesn't even kick in until 2020, right? So countries have interim targets, but we're going to be sort of 2025 probably before we're really in a position to kind of assess this and say, are we on the right track here? Are we meeting our goals? I think all of that leaves us, again, if we're serious about the goals, in a pretty urgent situation. I mean, in one sense, nothing has changed, right? These are promises on a piece of paper, essentially. All of the resistance that was there before is still there. All of the economic inertia that was there before is still there. The headwinds are still there. The political contributions to politicians willing to sort of stand up and say, I'm absolutely certain there's no problem, are still there. For that matter, contributions to places like MIT from fossil fuel companies are still there, right? So it's all, we have a tremendous task here if we're serious to sort of keep this thing moving forward and not see the political momentum that was represented by the Paris deal die. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to just try to tackle the question, okay, given all that, what do we need more of? I mean, I think if you're at MIT here and you're really wrestling with this question right now and you're trying to figure out how to make a contribution, a lot of that is, you've been at this for a long time now. You've been pushing. So have people at Harvard. So have people all over the country. What would help that we don't have right now? I'm going to give you some suggestions along those lines. One thing that maybe has not changed is our politics. So I think this week, somebody in the audience was pointing out to me, there's a whole series of votes unfolding in Congress. There was a vote of 50 to 49 in the Senate last night, rejecting an amendment that said climate change is caused primarily by human activity. So that's where we stand on Capitol Hill. The people in charge of the science committees down there are not just climate contrarians, they are actually conspiracy theorists. I mean, they believe that you all are engaged in a massive global hoax to sort of fool the public. So the politics in Washington has not changed, and it feels to me like this is shaping up as one of the more consequential elections of my lifetime, in the sense that, unless there's a wave election that completely changes the composition of Congress, this may look next year a lot like it does right now. And moreover, we may have a president who's ran on a campaign promise of undoing what little climate policy we have. So I think the politics have not changed. our policy has changed. So the Obama administration, through the Clean Air Act, sort of unilaterally has put in place a fairly ambitious policy on automobiles, 54 miles a gallon by 2030, something like that. They have put forward, as you know, the Clean Power Plan. That is still moving through the courts. But there have already been 4 or 5 Supreme Court decisions upholding Obama-era climate regulations, and so the likelihood, I would have to say, is that this regulation gets upheld. When that happens, there will be what you might call a sort of a weak set of policies in place that just barely might get us to that 2025 goal, that commitment that we've made. It's still a little unclear if it'll get us all the way there. And sort of any slippage, or for that matter, if emissions were to just take off again in the United States for some reason, we would not make the goals. These are this is in Montana. These are the forests. All those trees you see. It looks like a New England forest in the fall, but those are dying, dead and dying trees from pine beetle invasions. One thing that really is changing, I think, dramatically so, and this is an area where MIT could be tremendous help, is in the attitude of our companies, our corporations. So the consumer-facing brands are feeling tremendous pressure from their public, from the consumers, to do a better job on this issue, and we are beginning to see some really significant commitments from consumer-facing companies. The Unilevers of the world, the Procter & Gamble's of the world, they have, just within the last year or two, made huge promises about what they're going to do about deforestation. They have signed on to plans that call for cutting deforestation in half by 2020 and eliminating it entirely by 2030. Absolutely, completely unclear at this point how we're going to achieve that, but that's what we've been promised. A lot of these same companies are promising pretty big renewable energy, making pretty big renewable energy commitments. I don't know of anybody who's promised 100% yet, except for the tech companies. Some of the tech companies, by the way, are at 100% right now in terms of their purchases of renewable energy. We're starting to see these companies put pressure on state governments. We're starting to see, we have been seeing really for 10 years now, where the national government has frozen a tremendous amount of policy at the sort of state level, and increasingly we're seeing it at the local level. More than half the states have renewable portfolio standards, which means they're specifying a certain percentage of electricity has to come from renewables. You can debate whether that's the most efficient way to do it, but that's what they've been doing. And we are increasingly seeing cities, counties that want to be ambitious asking, how can we move forward? All these people need answers to some pretty simple questions. What do science-based targets look like? How ambitious do we need to be? If I'm New York City or San Francisco and I don't have the ability to set national policy, what can I do that would be most helpful? If there's limited amount of money to spend, where should it be spent? Should it be spent working on efficient building codes? What should we do? I think universities like MIT can help tremendously in clarifying that. So let me just talk about sort of what would help. What do we need more of? Well, for starters, we certainly need more science, right? We've heard that all day today. There are 3 huge uncertainties kind of interacting with each other here. There's the uncertainty about how sensitive the climate system is, right? We've got a pretty wide range still. We haven't narrowed that range since the great Joel Charney at this institution first wrote it down on paper in 1979. Honestly, a sort of badge of shame for the science that we haven't gotten any closer in that period. That is interacting with the uncertainty about how much we're actually going to emit, which might be an even bigger uncertainty, and those are interacting with the uncertainty about what the technological and economic response of human civilization will be. If we could narrow just one of those, if we could crack this cloud feedback thing and get a tighter constraint on climate sensitivity, it would help tremendously, I think, in sort of figuring out, what are the limits of our kind of risk envelope here. I know people have worked on it. I know it's a hard problem. We desperately need progress on that problem. One way I'm going to answer the question of what do we need more of is to tell you what we need less of. I personally would like to see fewer studies telling me that a carbon price would really help with this problem. We know that. I have 300 of these studies in my filing cabinet already. I get a new one 2 or 3 times a week. We get that a carbon price would help. Apparently, that is not how it's going to happen in the United States, okay? I've seen a lot of diagrams of people's integrated assessment models, economic models over the years. In those diagrams, I've never seen a loop that says political stupidity loop or political recalcitrance loop or anything like that. We need political stupidity loops in the models. They need to be invocable at any time and for the smallest of reasons. And then the model needs to recover and say, okay, it's 5 years later, you came to your senses, how do you get back on track, right? And we need models these models that just sort of solve for the least cost pathway. We're not going to do this by the least cost pathway. We're going to spend 2 or 3 or 4 times ultimately what we would need to spend if we were being rational about this and if we'd started 20 years ago. So we need more modeling of what the suboptimal sort of pathways look like. In other words, a political constraint on what's really achievable, and once you apply those constraints, what does the modeling say about, all right, now what's the lowest cost pathway given, the great unlikelihood that we're going to get, a carbon price, or certainly not a high carbon price, put in place. This is the drone flight over Greenland where you're seeing a pretty huge, the thing about Greenland is you have no sense of perspective. This is an enormous meltwater river disappearing into a moulin, and we now think it's going pretty much straight out into the ocean. That's not entirely clear, but that's the latest science. We need more practical planning on this problem. For as much work as has been done over the years, if you ask people, okay, what's the actual engineering of this? What do we need? What are the steps? And in particular, what are the trade-offs between meeting some fairly modest short-term goals versus meeting the long-term goals? There's actually very little out there. There is one project called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project that Jeff Sachs ginned up. I wrote about it just ahead of Paris, and that project tells us that there's some kind of hidden dangers in this problem. We are going to meet these short-term United States targets by going heavily into natural gas, for example. The long-term planning tells you that's actually a problem because in the 2040s and 2050s, we cannot afford natural gas. So if we go for huge natural gas infrastructure now, and the power plants may be less the issue here than the pipelines and things like that, we're locking ourselves potentially into a high carbon situation. Likewise, that work is telling us that we can only achieve the decarbonization with complete electrification of the transport fleet, coupled with a comprehensive decarbonization of the electricity system. Well, lo and behold, and in that work, this mass adoption of electric cars needs to be happening by about 2030. That's 14 years away, folks. I don't know if it feels to you like we've got people going gangbusters for electric cars, but it doesn't feel that way to me. And so we have got to get to a point where we're figuring out how to drive down costs of electric cars and push mass adoption. Last but definitely not least, is Richard Lester here by any chance? Did he register for the conference? So, what is he, your vice provost now, something like that? Richard Lester has done seminal work on this problem. I think people still have this idea in their heads that the solution to any of these big sort of social problems is we give money to universities, they work on sort of science projects, they produce technological options, and then industry picks those up and commercializes those and problem solved. That may be how things work in healthcare, it may be how things work in a lot of in tech. It's pretty clearly not how the energy system works. The clearest example is solar energy, where what a lot of people would describe as fairly kludgy policy over the last 10 or 15 years created a scaled up market, and lo and behold, we are now on something that looks a lot like sort of Moore's Law on the cost of solar panels. They're just plunging. Richard Lester's book, and I should have put a slide of it in here, and some people up at Harvard have done similar work, sort of tells us that that does not work in the energy system, right? This is a scale problem, and we need a lot more sort of creative thinking about how we get from sort of A to B. I'll finish by saying there was a big step in Paris. A lot of you probably saw the announcement about Bill Gates putting together a huge amount of money where private investors are going to put up risk capital to work on sort of energy solutions that can scale. And governments committed, we have yet to see if the Congress will go for this, but governments committed to doubling their R&D budgets. We badly need some fresh thinking about how we go from the options. And I feel like we're already drowning in possibilities, new battery ideas, all this stuff that people are working on there in the labs. How do we get from there to demonstrating these things at scale to making them sort of sensible economic options? That's the cutting edge of this whole problem at this point. I think I'm going to stop there. I believe we have time for a few questions, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, can I first invite the panel to just move towards the table while we take questions? Please.
I'm struggling with a relative who completely is well-educated, 2 master's degrees, doesn't believe a word of this, it's all a conspiracy, watches too much Fox News, I think. How do we get through to people like that?
Oh, boy. Yes, sorry about that. So the question is, how do we get through to people who just absolutely don't accept that this is a problem at all? Personally, I've sort of given up. I mean, maybe the best answer I can give you is we're not going to get through to them. They're not going to be convinced. They simply have to be beaten. And by that I mean, so if you look at the polling, what the polling tells you is 60% to 70% of the public understands that this is a problem. They do not, we're not, the body politic is not in a state of confusion about this. What they don't understand is the urgency of the problem. They don't understand the time lag. They don't understand the idea of sort of committed warming. And so I think people are walking around thinking, oh, someday they'll deal with that, And by the time, we're beginning to see a mass movement, actually, to sort of push on this. That's why those kids are out camping outside the president's office of MIT. What they are saying to the rest of us is enough already with business as usual. This is urgent. I don't know. I mean, I just don't have an answer. My experience with this is if people are really dug into the ideology of, this has got to be all a big hoax, I have found nothing that sort of moves them off the dime, is the honest truth.
I have a linguistic question since you're a writer. We refer to it as climate change or global warming, change and warming being fairly friendly terms, but it seems like disruption or destabilization might be better ways of framing it and seem to be more consistent with what we've heard today. And I wonder if there's discussion of that. And I could ask the same question about natural gas, which is methane, basically.
You know, Wally Broecker, the great Wally Broecker, who invented the term global warming decades ago, sent me an email recently and said, why don't you stop calling it warming and call it scorching? Why don't we call it global scorching? I mean, this is just what we call it, right? To some extent, we're stuck in the common terminology and the common usage. A lot of you don't remember this, but the suggestion to go from calling it global warming to calling it climate change was made by Republican pollster Frank Luntz, who was writing a memo this is 15 years ago, but about how to sort of defang this issue, and suggested coming up with this kind of friendlier, crunchier term. Since then, the climate scientists have been accused of trying to soften the term, but it actually wasn't them. I mean, climate change is the large problem. Global warming is a subset of that problem. To me, they seem like perfectly good terms as long as we explain to the public what we're talking about. That's my best answer to that.
We should move on with the panel. You
Thank
can
you.
just sit there. And thank you very much for great.